Before I begin our episode today, I'd just like to do a brief plug, if I may, about becoming a patron of this podcast. For as little as a couple of dollars or pounds per month, less than the price of a coffee, you can help me continue to make these podcasts. These podcasts couldn't really exist without the help of those who have already committed to support me in this way. My hope in the future will be to see God grow this ministry, providing other Christian-based content that can be seamlessly placed within other podcast genres, not just the Christian sector. Interest areas like history, philosophy and the arts as sort of my creative attempt at evangelism. But I'll only be able to do this and expand in this way if other people share my vision. My patrons also enjoy the benefit of accessing additional content such as bonus episodes of Christian teaching or preaching that I do outside the main Bible project, as well as talks that I do in secular environments. I'd like to give a special shout out to a couple of people who've joined in this way this week. I'll just use their first names for the purposes of privacy, but a special thank you to Patricia and a person with the rather mysterious moniker of TTH. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for those listening who offer their generous support in this way. For more information about becoming one of my patrons via Patreon, follow the link in the episode notes. And one other thing you might be interested in, a way of not only encouraging me and supporting me, a few of you know that I produce books periodically, and one of my latest projects is to do modern contemporary paraphrases of great classical Christian work. My motivation for doing this was when, over the last year or two, when studying philosophy, I found that when we needed to read or study these ancient texts, I found that we were always sent and were always able to study contemporary English versions of those texts. But I found that, interestingly, that when I looked at the same approach to foundational Christian writings, I found that that was not the case. There have been very few contemporary English versions since the Victorian age, and some for many, many hundreds of years even earlier than that. So I felt called, led, if you like, to start working on some contemporary paraphrases of what I believe are foundationally important Christian texts by people like Augustine, Calvin, Martin Luther, Marjorie Kemp, John Bunyan, and other Puritan writers, as well as Methodist writers like John and Charles Wesley. The first of these was published a few months back, and that was a contemporary English version of Martin Luther's commentary to the Galatians, which is available now on Amazon. But the next one that's due out is something that I began actually in 1995, when, as part of my theological studies, I had to do a contemporary translation from the original Latin, of one chapter of John Calvin's commentary on the book of James. So I picked that up again and ran with that recently, and have now completed that work, which is due for release. I'm not aware of just how much of an appetite there is for this, so I've decided to launch it on Kickstarter. That way, if I can get maybe 50, 80 pre-ordered books, I'll have the confidence to go to press with this one. I'll be self-publishing this one, as there doesn't seem to be enough appetite or interest in the potential for this book for it to be published by a mainstream publisher. So if you're interested in supporting that project, which you can do by just either giving £1 or $1 simply because you believe in it and share the values of the project, or you can actually go and support it by pledging £10 and secure a pre-order version of that book. Anyway, you can do that there, and I'll provide a link in the episode notes. But do hang around at the end, particularly if you're here for the first time, and I'll tell you lots of ways you can connect to this, my ministry, and receive additional free Bible study resources. So with that said, I'll say bye for now. Okay, today, friends, we're looking at the first half of Mark chapter 14 in our 6th season together on the Bible Project Daily podcast, the first 11 verses, and I've called today's little talk, What a Waste. What would you consider a waste? And what would you consider it means to be wasteful? Now, you may think about some things that you would consider to be a waste of money or a waste of time, but what's the first thing that springs to your mind when you consider what it means to be wasteful? Well, that's what I want to talk today about, is this idea of wastefulness. But in doing so, I want to talk to you about a right and wrong view of what it means to be wasteful first. Sometimes we can waste things of extreme value, things that are much more important than even time or money. And sometimes we can waste things that have no real value. So is that just as important? In the text we're looking at today, it begins with Jesus making an announcement about his coming death. And then we're told a lady anoints him with, on this occasion, some very expensive oil. Now we know from other passages this lady was called Mary. She's not described that way here, but we can pick that up if we look at the other gospel accounts. And then finally this passage will close and tell us what the disciples said and what Judas did and how he actually begins the process of betraying the Lord. So let's begin, and I'll do as I'll always do. I'll go through it verse by verse, or a couple of verses at a time, and then when we've done an expository run through the text, I'll then try and think about what it means for us today and pull it all together. Now, you will remember, if you've been with me this last few days, that we've already been told previously that the religious leaders have set their plans to kill him. And now we see the scribes and the chief Pharisees gather together to decide exactly how they're going to bring this about. So Mark 14:1 and 2 says, "Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the scribes of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus and kill him, but not during the festival because they feared the people might riot." Now bear in mind that these religious leaders, they've not only decided to kill him, but they're deciding to do it using sort of plotting, trickery, deceit if you like. Think about it. Religious people, religious leaders actually planning to commit murder. They also recognize that they dare not do it during this festival because that would cause uproar. They know that a great many people are seeing him as at least a prophet and perhaps some as Messiah. So the religious leadership have a real problem here. Now, just for a moment, let's leave them where they are with a little dilemma, their big dilemma really, and move to the next part of the story. But before we do, I just want to say one thing. Jesus is going to die. God prophesied it, he announced it, and these guys are plotting it, so it is going to happen. Now, there are a number of ways Christians can look at the death of Christ. Some will talk about the fact that he's a substitute for us, the one who died in our place for our sins, and that, of course, is certainly true. But it is the aspect of Jesus dying as a sacrifice I want to look at this morning. Jesus sacrificing himself for us. I want us to think about what that means, and what it means when it says that. When it tells us that God loved us so much that he sacrificed his only begotten Son, as it tells us in John 3:16. So let's return to the story, back into Mark, and consider how it illustrates that particular aspect, and pick up the text in the next verse, which says, "While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table of the home of Simon a leper," this is Jesus that's talking about obviously, "a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head." Now let me explain what's going on here. It was customary for a host to take something like this, a sort of an expensive oil or perfume, and put a single drop on each of their guests as they arrived, usually on their forehead. What she does is she takes the whole jar, which, by the way, as the text tells us, would have been very, very valuable, and she breaks the jar, which of course renders the jar worthless as well, and she pours all of it on Jesus' head. She took something that's very expensive, very costly, and she uses it to anoint the Lord. I think I can confidently say she really was sacrificing something for him here. That's what it symbolized. She took the most valuable thing, I believe probably the most valuable thing she owned, and she sacrificed it for the Lord. Now let me tell you what reward she gets from the disciples anyway, and the others around, for the fact that she made this sacrifice. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this, the waste of perfume?" Now it's worth noting at this point that one of the other gospel writers identifies which disciple actually said this. John 12:4-6 says, "But one of his disciples, the one named Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, 'Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it." So we can see from John's account what's really going on in the background here. But here we see this general group of people also saying, agreeing with him, "Why is this oil being wasted?" So back to Mark's account. Mark 14 verse 5 says, "It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor, and they rebuked her harshly." You know what? If you ever do anything worthwhile for Jesus Christ, it seems to me it's likely you will be criticized. It's just the way it goes. You may even be criticized by your friends and family, and sadly sometimes even by people in the church. But criticism, if you think about it, criticism is never an act of love. On occasion someone may come to you with a correction, and that can be out of love. But criticism, I would suggest, done in a critical way, is never loving, and rarely comes up front to your face. Criticism of an idea of a teaching is okay, but criticism of an individual is wrong. And criticism tends to be behind the back of a person and not to their face anyway. Usually it's also done about a third party. You see, godly concern, or even coaching you might call it, and correction are a different thing. They come gently, face to face, and speak to the person, but criticism is different. The minute it leaves the mouth of the critic, it lands in the mouth of a third party, because it's usually shared more widely than just that individual, and then it literally goes out in the world and becomes nothing more than gossip. And if you read James chapter 3, you can see what the Bible says about gossip and how that is like an evil wildfire that spreads uncontrollably. So the question we have to ask ourselves as Christians is often, why am I being criticized? And if I am being, how should I survive it and not be brought down by it? Well, the main thing I believe is to keep in mind that what you're doing is work for the Lord. If you're doing it in order to serve him without reward, and because of that you experience unjust criticism, then do not allow yourself to be worn down by it. Be encouraged by the fact that you are serving the King. Now, I'm not trying to say that this stuff doesn't hurt. It will hurt. And look at this passage. By the way it was written, it says they criticized and rebuked her harshly. Have you ever been criticized unfairly? I'm sure you'll know just how much it hurt. So, beloved, please bear in mind the real reason why people might be doing the criticizing. On this occasion, Mary is the one person in the room who is recognized and has sacrificed for Jesus. She's the one making the sacrifice, and she thinks this perfume oil is nothing of value when it comes to giving it up for him. She sacrifices the most valuable thing she owns, and she's criticized for it. But Jesus himself understood this, and this is why he is seen to reply in verses 6-8. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could, and she poured the perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." So Jesus says she's actually done a beautiful thing. She's come before him, and don't make the big point, she's making her sacrifice, and he says she's actually anointing his body for burial. And Jesus responds and says, "You guys, you'll always have the opportunities to supposedly help the poor, and you should, but I'm not always going to be here. And if you had listened and taken in what I have been repeatedly saying about sacrifice and about being sacrificed and dying for your sin, you would realize that there is a limited opportunity for you to do something sacrificial for me first." And Mary is the one here who takes that opportunity. I believe she's the only one who really got the whole big picture at this point, more so even than the disciples. Jesus on many occasions had said, I'm going to die. Maybe she's the one follower who, sitting at his feet that day, realized completely what that meant. The others, they seem to miss it or not get it yet. That's my personal opinion anyway. And she took what she had and she sacrifices it for him because she knew the opportunity to do that was limited. Forget about the fact she got no reward from the others seated around, just criticism. Look at the response she gets from the Lord. Verse 9 tells us, this is Jesus speaking, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So Jesus honours her. He honours her and actually sort of memorialises her. Maybe one of the lessons we can learn from this passage is if you get criticised today, you will in fact be honoured in some way later. If you understand that the criticism that you get from detractors and gossip doesn't really matter in the great scheme of things, and it certainly doesn't matter when you compare it to the honour and reward you're going to receive later. The message here is do all you can to honour the Lord today and accept any criticism that comes, because ultimately you will receive honour later. I come originally from a place called Northern Ireland and a farming community. And you know, those farmers, a great many of them are Christians, and they're known for their generosity. And I heard the story once of a chap who went to his friend and he said, I don't understand how you're able to give so much away and yet you seem to remain so well off. You're still wealthy. In fact, no matter what the circumstances are, you always seem to have more to give. He said, let me explain. He said, I keep shoveling my stuff into God's bin, but he keeps shoveling back into mine at exactly the same rate. But how does that work, said the friend, if you're being blessed and things are going well for you, if you're both shoveling at the same rate? And he said, well, the truth of the matter is God has a much bigger shovel. Okay, as I said at the beginning of this passage, it starts with Jesus announcing his death. Let's not forget that. Then there's this incident when Jesus is anointed for burial by Mary. Then Judas, having witnessed this, is seen to go and begin this process of not only criticizing her, but starting to do something, well, quite despicable, really. Verses 10 and 11 say what he does next. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So, she was devoted, he is disloyal. Remember earlier I said that the chief priests and the scribes had a problem? They had a dilemma about how and when they could do this. Well, Judas now has solved their problem, and their problem is solved with just a little bit of money. In the opening verse we looked at today, the chief priests and the teachers of the law we saw were scheming to arrest Jesus and secretly kill him, and Judas now, by going to them, has solved their problem and enabled their plan to come to fruition. And one final observation, it was also remembered Jesus who called what Mary did a waste. And that's ironic because Judas is about to waste his entire life. What he wastes is his very soul, and he sells it, as we shall see later, for just 30 pieces of silver. That, my friend, is truly the greatest waste of all. Forget about a supposed wasted jar of perfumed oil. This is more than a waste of stuff, a waste of money. This is a wasted life, a wasted opportunity to give his life over in service of God. What a waste indeed. When Jesus announced his death, Mary responded by sacrificing and making arrangements in a way, preparing herself and him for his upcoming burial. But Judas, he responded by making arrangements for betrayal. So what are we to make of all this? How does this actually practically work out, help us decide how we should live our lives? Well, I'd like to make just a couple of suggestions. Well, one thing I would say is this. If God did indeed send Jesus to be a sacrifice in the way that Mary understood it, if God did indeed sacrifice his son for us, then how should we respond? Well, clearly we should not waste the opportunity. We shouldn't waste our life. If I can be very blunt, we shouldn't be so stupid as Judas was. We shouldn't miss the opportunity to recognize the truth standing before us and trust it and trust him for our eternity. God sacrificed his son, and even that's mentioned in the story. And Mary, she's seen here as an example to someone responding at an incredibly profound level. For her, it is illustrated with the value of the bottle of perfumed oil, the most valuable thing that she had. And maybe too, we are too called to sacrifice something of value for the Lord. If Christ really sacrificed himself for us, then surely there's no sacrifice that's too great for us to make for him. And also remember, friends, like our Irish farmer, always remember you cannot ever outgive God. I wonder if you've ever sacrificed something for the Lord. Have you ever sacrificed money for the Lord? Ever planned to spend something on yourself and then decide, you know what, I'm just going to give it to the Lord in this way for this situation? How maybe you've planned to spend time doing something for yourself and then instead at the last minute decided to give that time over to the Lord instead. Don't get lost in the detail of the story. The big point is she made a decision to sacrifice for the Lord that day, and that's the main thing. And God, he sacrificed, and he sacrificed his only son Jesus, his most valuable, precious possession. And anything at the end of the day that we sacrifice for him will always be worthwhile and appropriate because it's meaningful if it's a sacrifice, but it's nothing compared to what he gave for us. Then add to the fact that we are told that whenever and wherever the story is told, it stands as a memorial to her. So if you make a sacrifice, whether that be of time, money, talent, service, anything really, then God is ultimately going to honour you. So don't live your life wasting for yourself, I believe this is telling us, when you could be investing yourself and your resources in sacrificing and serving for the Lord. I heard of a story told in India during my father's travels there. He was a missionary there in the 1960s. It's a sort of a story, a modern-day Christian parable, and it was used in that culture at that time as a way of connecting with people. It was an illustration that he used to use. The story is told of a beggar in India who sat at the roadside begging for alms, and he held out his bowl with a few grains of rice in the bottom, and people passing by would drop in a handful of rice. One day he saw this grand possession passing by and he thought, oh good, the prince of the region is coming my way. Surely he will have a gold coin or something more valuable than the rice that I normally receive, and he will give me that today. And the prince and the possession did pass by, and he did in fact stop by the beggar, who held out his bowl and waited eagerly to see what the prince would put in it. But to his surprise, the prince said, how much rice are you willing to give me today? The beggar answered, I can't do that. This is all I have. This is all I have to live on. Again the prince said to him, I want your rice. Again the beggar said, no, I will not give you my rice. I'll starve if I do that. Again the prince said, give me some of your rice then, please. The beggar sighed finally and reached into his bowl and took out 3 grains of rice and put them in the hand of the prince. The prince then reached into his bag and took out 3 gold coins and dropped them in the beggar's bowl and moved on. The beggar looked in his bowl regretfully and thought, why didn't I just give everything I had in my bowl? Then I might have received something back even greater. Okay friends, we're in Mark 14. We're on the home straight, if you like, in our journey together in season 6 through the Gospel of Mark, and we'll be looking particularly today at chapters 12 to 25. And we'll be looking at this episode from the point of view of what is a memoriam. You see, as nations, as countries, we do love to build memorials, don't we? Now, a memorial by definition is an object which serves as a focus for the memory of a person or an event. Sometimes it can be very large or tall, like a pillar or a structure. Sometimes it can even be a whole building when it comes to the great and the good. However, memorials are not always big and imposing and impressive things. Sometimes they can just be like a sculpture or a fountain, or if we get down for the ordinary man and woman like ourselves, it's more likely to be something like that you choose to remember the person by. Perhaps something they did, a painting, or a plaque, or something that was important to them. Sometimes societies even memorialize people in stamps or coins. And it's not just we British that like to memorialise things. It seems to me that in many different ways across all cultures that humans need to create memorials of some sort or the other. So the question I'm asking today was, if God decided to establish a memorial, what would it look like? Well, interestingly for us, there are two great examples of God instituting memorials in the Bible, and both of them are going to be referred in the passage that we're going to look at today. In the first part of today's passage, we're told about preparing for something called the Passover. And then in the second part of the passage, it tells us about the preparation itself and what happens during this Passover celebration in what is called the upper room. And then in the closing section of today's passage, it will actually tell us about a new memorial remembrance event that the Lord himself instituted on this occasion. So we're going to start with the preparation and walk through the passage and see these two memorial events side by side. And of course they're called the Passover and the Lord's Supper. The Passover was of course instituted in the Old Testament, but we see here the Lord's Supper, communion, instituted here in the New Testament and done so by Jesus himself. So we're going to pick up exactly where we left off yesterday at chapter 14, and we're beginning today in verse 12, and we'll go through it verse by verse, as is always our pattern, and then at the end we'll try and put it all together and think about what it actually means for us today. So it begins by telling us in Mark chapter 14, verse 12, that on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" We see here in this opening verse the disciples asking Jesus how and where they're going to celebrate their Passover meal together. Now that makes sense when you realise that these guys are all from Galilee and they probably didn't know Jerusalem that well. They're not in their hometown. Their hometown is 68 miles down the road. So they say to Jesus, "How are we going to do this Passover celebration here in this place?" And this is what Jesus says. Mark 14, 13 and 15. So he sent two of his disciples out, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him and say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there.'" Now, does that strike you as a bit mysterious? Just go into the city, Jesus says, and follow some random guy carrying a water pitcher. Follow him, and wherever he ends up, you ask the owner there if he has a large room ready for them to use. Now, there's one rather unusual and interesting little fact here, missed by most people, I find, when they approach these verses. How would they know which man to follow, some say? He didn't say follow the first man you see with a jar of water. Some would say, well, and I've heard preachers teach about the fact that there were hundreds of men carrying a jar of water. Well, the answer is, at that time, only women were meant to carry pitchers of water, and they usually carried them on their heads. It was considered a task only for women. The wells were usually surrounded by women, and in fact it was their meeting place, and they would talk together as they filled their jars. And it would not normally have been appropriate for a man to go there. So a man carrying water would have been unusual. In fact, usually men just carry their own personal water supply in a small leather pouch. So a man carrying a jar of water in itself would have been quite unusual. And let me make one other small point about this. Many Bible teachers have concluded that this place where they're going to eat the Lord's Supper together is the same place that's mentioned later in Acts chapter 1, where we see after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the disciples regather for the church's first prayer meeting. The next verse tells us the disciples left, as they were told, went into the city and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. Now there's two sorts of preparing going on here. One was by the owner of the house, the man prepared the room in itself, and the other would be by the disciples who are now setting about to prepare the Passover meal itself. For this, they would have needed 4 different cups of wine, some bitter herbs, and some unleavened bread. The preparation would have included setting out the unleavened bread and the wine, and also the preparation of the bitter herbs, which involved creating a sauce made of several ripened spices mixed with bitter fruits with wine into a sort of paste, not forgetting the roasting of the Passover lamb itself. So there's quite a bit involved here. But remember, this is a memorial meal that was originally commissioned in the Old Testament. We looked at that some months back when we went through the book of Exodus. This is a memorial that the God himself had instituted. Interesting to me is that today, when men and women commission memorials, they tend to build buildings or even cast huge statues out of marble or bronze. But here, when God commissions a memorial, what does he do? He creates a simple meal, not a monument. The Passover, in fact, in the Old Testament was an annual fellowship meal. God used Moses to institute that meal so that God's people would always remember how God had rescued them out of slavery. So included in the meal, as I said, was a paste of bitter herbs, and that was meant to act as a reminder of that bitter time spent in slavery. And then also the lamb represents the sacrificial lamb whose blood was placed on the doorsteps of the houses, so that when the angel of death passed in that Exodus story, passed over the cities and the houses, the ones marked with the blood of the lamb would not have their firstborn struck down by the angel of death as it went across the land. The meal also consisted of unleavened bread, because when they escaped from Egypt, they had to mix the meal in a hurry, and they had had no time to wait for the bread to rise before they fled to Egypt, and the unleavened bread reminds them of that and the haste in which they fled. But the point is simply this: this Passover meal, instituted in the Old Testament, was a memorial. It was God's memorial fellowship meal. That's the way he remembered it, not through a monument or a building, by gathering people together as family to celebrate and remember with a meal. So this is what they're preparing for. And in the next few verses, it tells us what happens at this particular Passover evening when they gather together with Jesus. Mark 14:17 says, "When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one of who is eating with me.'" Now, if you've been following along with us, we have been going through the Gospel of Mark together. You will know that several times before this evening, Jesus had actually announced to these guys that he was indeed going to die. That should not be news to you, and it should not really have been news to them either. But what is new news is that this is the first time he says he's going to be betrayed by one of them. And of course, when they hear that, they begin to question among themselves and him who that person might be. Verses 19 and 20 tell us they were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "and the one who dips bread into the bowl with me." Now, it helps us to understand that at the Passover meal, the one who first dipped into the cup was deemed to be the one who had the place of honour. The leader of the Passover supper would tear bread and dip pieces of bread in the juices from the roasted lamb, and then dip them in the bitter herbs and pass it on to the one who is specially selected to dip it in the cup of wine. So the passing of the bread to dip it in the wine is potentially a great honour. Well, let's look at what is said next. Mark 14:21. "The Son of Man will go out just as it is written before him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." So this is the first part of this passage where we see that familiar term, "it is written." What that is telling us is that God planned this, that it was always going to happen. And the second part of this verse simply says that the person who does it is going to be responsible for his actions. So although God planned it, they're still going to do this of their own free will, their own volition, and they will be held accountable for that. One author I read said this about this, and I quote, "God has given us wills that are free. His love appeals to us, His truth warns us, but there is never compulsion. It is the awful responsibility of humanity that we can reject the appeal of God's love and disregard the warnings of His voice. In the end, there is no one but our own self who is responsible for our own sin." So they have the Passover meal, and during the meal, Jesus announces that in fact it is Judas who would betray him. The narrative continues in verses 22 and 23, and it says, "While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take, this is my body.' Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it." Now this, of course, is a very familiar sounding passage to us, because it's one we often refer to when we share the Lord's Supper or communion together. But remember, what's going on here is happening in the middle of them observing the Passover meal together. The Old Testament memorial, which was a meal, but here Jesus is instituting it into a new way, a new memorial, a second memorial if you like, one that we today call the Lord's Supper, or communion, or even the Eucharist in some traditions. But what they were not used to hearing at this point is Jesus saying to them, "Eat this bread, for this is my body, and do this in remembrance of me," which means that it is this point in time, this new memorial fellowship meal is established. And it's been established in order to mark his upcoming death. And then the next verse 24 tells us, and he says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many." So we need to pause and talk about this for a moment, because clearly this is important stuff. This is the institution of the new covenant, it says. But what does it mean by the new covenant? Well, first, there was, of course, an old covenant, and now the new covenant. Now, the word covenant is a word that means simply a written will, a testament, a promise, something that has been written down. Now, you will no doubt notice that the Bible is divided into two parts. Most people know that. They know there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. Well, in fact, covenant and testament are almost the same words. We, in fact, use both words interchangeably to this day. But we have to think about what do they actually really mean. Now, maybe a way of helping is if I asked if any of you listening to this have made a will. A last will and testament legally is a contract between one person and another or other individuals and groups of people, in which it is a legal situation where one person says how it is going to be and writes it down. The other person is just the recipient of it. So when Jesus talks about a new covenant, he's instituting a memorial, a new promise, if you like, that Jesus has shed his blood to pay for the sins of many. The old covenant was the Mosaic covenant, where there was a tabernacle and sacrifices would be offered there. But according to the New Testament, that old covenant has been fulfilled once and for all by Jesus, and because of that, he swept that away. And Jesus has established this new covenant, which is to be sealed by his death and resurrection for sin. We are now in the family of God because of this new promise, this new covenant, because of what Christ Jesus did for us. It's no longer access to God through religion. It's now, under the new deal, access to God by relationship. And then the last verse we're looking at today tells us, "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." So a couple of observations worth making here at the end. That verse demonstrates that the kingdom of God is not present at this point, it's future. When Jesus comes back, when he sets up the kingdom, so in other words, the fulfillment of this is not fulfilled in its entirety in the church today, as some suggest. It is filled ultimately and only fulfilled in the future return of Christ. And one other point, if he's going to die, and that's at some point in the future, he's going to return again to drink the fruit of the vine. So what is the event that lies in between his death And his returning, well, clearly that must be the resurrection. Jesus makes clear here by his institution of the Lord's Supper that after he dies he's going to be raised because he's coming back. And that's how they brought their evening, their Passover evening, to an end. It tells us how they ended. In fact, in verse 26, it says they sung a hymn and they went out to the Mount of Olives. Okay, that's the text. So let me try and pull this all together and sum it up and make the application that I think it means for us today. The passage is telling us that during the Passover, which was the memorial of the Exodus event, remember, the deliverance from Egypt, Jesus identifies Judas as the one who's going to betray him. And at the same meal, he institutes the new promise, the Lord's Supper, which is now a memorial to memorialize his death and resurrection. But the point to note is that when Jesus establishes a memorial, what does he do? It's not a building, it's not a temple we go to, it's not a statue we go and prostrate before. His memorial is a time of fellowship together, a meal, a love feast. Both in the Old and in the New Covenant, this is what God uses to establish his memorials. You see, the Passover and the Lord's Supper, yes, they are related. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. We too today are slaves to sin. In the Passover, the destroyer, bringing physical death, passed over the house of everyone except those passed over and struck, but he passed over and didn't act on those houses marked with the blood of the Lamb. And the Lord's Supper is a reminder also that death will also pass over us, because we too are marked with the blood of the Lamb. The Passover meal was eaten once a year, but the Lord's Supper, we are told, should be eaten regularly. I'd like to make another what I think is important observation, and that is, quite simply, that the Passover meal was a family meal eaten at home, in genealogical family groups. However, the Lord's Supper is eaten by groups of people of faith, in a community of believers, the new family of believers. Another way of saying this, that it is now celebrated together in the church, i.e. the church being the family of God, and now it is celebrated by faith. Which means effectively at this point, this memorial was created as a way of marking the fact that Jesus would die in order to institute a community of believers, a family of faith, which most of us today call the church. Now, I know Jesus Christ died in our place to pay the price of our sins, and I do believe that very strongly. But I sometimes think, particularly in the Protestant and the Reformed Church, we kind of skip over the fact that Jesus Christ died to institute his family, his church in the world. Listen to what it tells us in Ephesians chapter 5 about this. Husbands, Paul writes, love your wife, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. There's a very real sense in which Jesus died in order to create a spiritual community, a spiritual family that we now today call the church. I believe he did this because he knew that we cannot grow spiritually alone. We can't do it in isolation. It's not possible. It cannot happen. No matter how good the resources you might find online, friend, you cannot grow spiritually in isolation. Because who's going to ask you questions? Who's going to challenge you what you think? Who's going to call you to account when you get things wrong? Living in spiritual isolations mean you will become a self-reflecting spiritual echo chamber. But the most important reason you cannot grow into a mature Christian in isolation is you won't have anybody to love, to practically love in real terms. And more to the point, you won't be able to forgive people. You may individually to choose some lovely people if you live in isolation, who the few people that you already know and love you, but we are called to love all kinds of people, and you can only do that by being in the wider community called the church. Hebrews 10:25 reminds us to not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. This podcast has never meant to be a replacement for church. In fact, at the end of the pandemic, I strongly advised everyone to return to their church communities. And if you found this as a way of trying to replace church, I understand that times can be difficult for people and they need to sort of retreat for a little while and ground themselves in the Word of God again, particularly if they've had a bad experience in church. But the call of God is for us to be together in community. It seems to me that coming together is vitally important to your spiritual development. So much so that it was Christ himself who instituted our coming together regularly as a community. And in fact, I would suggest that this implies that this coming together as a community, part of it will be having the Lord's Supper together, but that is the thing of being with other Christians, being accountable and being challenged will be the thing that will have the greatest impact on your spiritual life, more so than any preaching that I or anybody else might do. That's not to put down Bible study or preaching, online or in real person. It just recognises that there's a bigger aspect to this. We are all meant to be impacted and influenced by each other. We need to hang out with other Christians, it said. It's just common sense. Every mother in the land knows they don't want their children to hang out with the wrong crowd. Why? Because they know they'll be influenced by the people that they hang around with. So you, my friend, need to hang out with other Christians in order to be influenced by them, as well as to be able to express the forgiveness of sin that God forgave you of other people as well. Jesus died so that people could come together as friends and community into the presence of God. Now also, another important fact is within any group of Christians there are going to be some who are more spiritually mature than others, and they could therefore have the ability to constructively influence one another on our Christian journeys. So when we come together in this thing called church, what we do is we bring together spiritually minded people who are able to influence those who tend to be more, shall I say, carnally minded. Now, no one in the church is perfect, but within the body of Christ, we should find people, examples of all types of people. Some people are wonderful examples of one particular aspect of the character of God, and some will exemplify other aspects. And that's why we need community. We need each other. And Jesus here gave his all. He gave his all in order to save us. Yes, that's ultimately it. But he also did it in order to create an imperfect, but hopefully a loving community of people who come together because they want to serve him. And he, in fact, here established that memorial meal so that we'll always remember to do that, to gather together, to be together, and do that regularly.
Did you know the garden can be a dangerous place? Ask any emergency room, or what we call in the UK any A&E doctor. Gardens in our Bible are also seen to be potentially dangerous places. In the very first chapter of the Bible, we're told that God made a garden and it was perfect. He put Adam and Eve in it, and he told them that they could eat of any fruit, except for the fruit of one tree that he called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Hopefully you'll already know that story. We certainly dealt with it in detail in our opening season. They were unable to withstand the temptation, and they disobeyed God, and as a result, spiritual death came upon not just them, but the whole human race. But in a sense, God has also placed us in a garden. I mean, we all have temptations lying at the heart of our lives. Growing in the center are our own personal situations as well. What is the tree of temptation growing in the center of your garden? Is it anger? Is it resentment? Is it gossip? Is it a desire for wealth, money, possessions, or even the need for power and the ability to control other people? How do you master such temptations? We know how important it is to stop these things creeping in like weeds and taking over you by surprise, mastering you in fact. How is it that so many Christians, even today, particularly today, are overtaken by temptation, sometimes before they even notice those weeds appearing? How do we indeed overcome temptation? Well, there's another Bible in the garden, and that was called Gethsemane. And what happened there is important because it stands as an illustration of how potentially we too can be overcome by temptation. Now, it's a long passage of scripture today that we're looking at, And it begins with Jesus making a prediction, and then there's an account of what happens in this garden called Gethsemane, and then we see the arrest of Jesus. Now, I believe that Mark intended this entire passage to be understood as a unit, because the prediction we're going to look at in the opening verses 27 and 28, are going to be fulfilled by his arrest when we reach the closing verses. So let's begin looking at the text where we left off yesterday, and I'll begin by reading Mark chapter 14, 27 and 28. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. So here we are. This first part of the passage begins with Jesus predicting something when he actually says you will fall away. What could be clearer than that? You will fall away, he says. Then he quotes a passage from Zechariah 13 verse 9, in fact, which says about when the shepherd is struck down, the sheep are scattered. But note he also tells them that after he's been raised, he will go before them into Galilee. Don't miss that, friends. It's there as clear as the nose on your face. Jesus, before he's even been arrested, states he's going to be deserted by his followers. In fact, he's going to die and be resurrected again. It's all there for them, and he also notes that he will meet up with them again afterwards. So even though they're going to fall away, even though they're going to desert him, even though they will deny him, in fact, those actions will not end his relationship with them. He is telling them, and I believe all of us today, that there can still be a reunion even after you mess up or fall away. I don't know what could be more encouraging to Christian believers than to hear that. The text continues, picking up in verse 29. Peter declared, even if everyone falls away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the cock crows twice, you will yourself disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you, Lord. And all the others said the same. Now, can you see the irony of what Peter's saying here, considering the events that are going to follow? Peter is saying to Jesus, what you have just said, Lord, well, it applies to everyone else, but not to me. This is a perfect example of what I've heard described as leaf blower Christianity. You know, people who go about and they deal with the problem in their situation by putting a leaf blower to it and blowing it across so it just lands on other people, in their mind's eye anyway. Every preacher I've spoken to recognizes this when it comes to having a pulpit ministry. You preach on something, and the one person in the congregation who you believe really is the one who doesn't need to take the message at heart, they're the very one who comes up and tells you how convicted and challenged they are by what you said. And the other ones, the ones that perhaps in your mind you felt needed to take heed of the spiritual message, they just take their spiritual leaf blower, so to speak, and blow the meaning across so it lands on everybody else in the congregation in their mind. Pretty much blow all the problems over the hedge, so their perspective is all the problems lie in the neighbour's garden, so to speak, if you don't mind me continuing to use that metaphor. The word is preached and they think, I know what this is true, but I know who it applies to. It applies to them over there, and it certainly doesn't apply to me. So-and-so over there really needs to learn this lesson, but not me. And in a sense, that's what Peter is guilty of here. However, because Peter didn't recognize that the message is for him, Jesus then chooses to say to Peter, no, Peter, you're going to do exactly this, and you're going to do it, in fact, this very evening. You'll deny me 3 times. Did Peter accept the reprimand? His response, he even gets more dogmatic, and he says, even if I had to die, I wouldn't deny you, Lord. So he's really in this position where he's saying, no, Lord, you need to look at the others. I'm the exception to the rule here. Now, I think we're all guilty of this at a certain level. Sometimes I think we read the Bible and we tend in our mind's eye to apply it to other people and think that's relevant for them. But that's not what Jesus is trying to get at here, and I certainly don't believe that's what he's trying to teach us. Okay, that's the opening part. Let's look at the second part of the passage that takes us into the garden. Matthew 14:32 to 34. They went to a place called Gethsemane, And Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said. "Stay here and keep watch." Now, the Garden of Gethsemane, I'm told by people who've been there, lies at the base of the Mount of Olives. And it is there that Jesus turns to his group of disciples and says to them, "You guys stay here." And then he selects Peter, James, and John, his sort of inner circle, so to speak, and he says to those three, "You come with me." And he goes deeper into the garden, actually among the olive trees, it says. And in there he says to them, "Stay here and keep watch." So he tells them that to stay there, to keep watch, and he goes off to pray even deeper into the garden. And it is there we see him become deeply troubled and distressed. In fact, to the point where he says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." So why is the Lord in such an emotional state? Why is he so bothered? I suppose none of us would look forward to our death if we knew it was coming, and certainly not a death on the cross. But is that what is really overwhelming him? Well, let's keep reading, verse 35 and 36. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if it is possible that the hour might pass him by. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." So this is very important to recognize what's really troubling here. What makes him distress? Well, it's this thing he refers to as the cup. The expression, the cup that he's referring to, comes from the Old Testament. Jeremiah chapter 25, in fact. And it describes the judgment of God, the judgment cup of God on sin. So what Jesus is distressed about here is he fully understands what he must face. He knows what is really going to happen, not just his physical death, but he has to take upon himself our sin, in fact the sin of the world, so that this judgment of God might fall upon that sin which he will be bearing, in order that we all might walk free. Not just our own individual sin, that's part of it, and we need to recognize that, but the sin of every single human being who has ever walked on this planet. As 2 Corinthians tells us in chapter 5, verse 21, "For he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God." I think the toughest part of this is the fact that he knew what was going to happen. Bad things are at their worst when you know they're going to happen. But in our case, we can't change the future. But the thing to bear in mind is that he could have chosen not to go through with this. A preacher I heard once said it in this way: Jesus chose to go to hell for you rather than to go to heaven without you. Well put, that man, I say. He chooses to be separated from God so that we wouldn't have to be. So that's what Jesus has been going through here. Let's go see how the disciples are doing. Remember, they were left behind and told to stay awake and guard the entrance to the area where he was. Are they wide awake? Are they perhaps deep in spiritual prayer? Let's see. Not even close, sadly. Verses 37 and 38. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon. Now he calls him by his old name here. I think that's interesting. He calls him Simon, but he says to Peter, same guy, "Are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?" But remember, this is the guy who just a moment ago said, "I would die for you than ever betray you or let anything happen." And Jesus says, "Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." And then sighing, he says, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Willing to die for the Lord, supposedly, but he couldn't even stay awake and pray and watch out for him for 1 hour. How many Christians are willing to die for the Lord on Sunday morning, but spiritually sleep Monday to Saturday? For us too, the spirit can be willing, but the flesh is indeed weak. Let's see if things get any better. Mark 14, verses 39 and 40. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. At least this time, they kind of appeared to be embarrassed, didn't they? Peter had just promised the Lord this huge thing, yet he'd failed the Lord even in the smallest of things. He couldn't even stay awake. He couldn't even keep praying for an hour. Let's see if it gets any better. Returning a third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise up. Let's go. Here comes my betrayer." So this third time he comes, and the third time they are asleep again. "Enough," he says. "Well, it's time to get up. The hour has come. I'm about to be betrayed." So here we go. We've looked at two parts of this passage so far. Firstly, the prediction that the disciples are going to fall away. You can see that beginning, can't you? And secondly, the prayer time in the Garden of Gethsemane, when not only did Jesus say to them, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation," but they couldn't even stay awake. So why was it important that they stay awake? Why was it important that they did not fall asleep? Well, let's see what happens next. Mark 14:43. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. "Remember, look," he said, "my betrayer comes." Now, from other passages elsewhere, we know that this crowd included members of the Sanhedrin, what were referred to as the temple police, and Roman soldiers, and a sort of general rabble as well. So this was a large crowd. A multitude is the term the King James uses. The text continues, "Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." And going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Now, it was customary for a student to greet a teacher or a rabbi with a kiss. No one looking on might have interpreted this as anything unusual, but on this occasion it serves as a notice to the authorities as to which one the Jesus guy they're looking for is. And notice Jesus also reverted to just using his technical title. He called him Rabbi. On this occasion he no longer called him Lord. He didn't refer to him as the Saviour, and there we have it. Famously, Judas betrays him with a kiss. And then, verses 46 and 47, the men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now, elsewhere in other gospel accounts, we're told that it was actually Peter who did this. It seems Peter is back on the case again, but maybe not in the best way, but impetuous again. And Jesus speaks in response to this, verses 48 and 49, by saying, "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me then. But that the scriptures must be fulfilled." Now, the scriptures that being fulfilled in this point is clearly, he's referring to Isaiah 53, one that says that he will be numbered against the transgressors. In other words, he's going to be identified and arrested as just a common criminal. So let's look again and see how the disciples get on now. Will they stand firm? Will they remain loyal with him? Well, the next verse tells us, "Then everyone deserted him and fled." So just as he said in verse 7, "I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter," this has occurred. And that's why I think this entire passage is tied together. It started when we opened with the prediction, and it ends here with this fulfillment of it. Now, what I want us to do is see the whole passage as a unit, as many Bible commentators suggest it should be. And this gives us an overview of where we can see Jesus predicting that his disciples are going to desert him, fall away, and in the end we see them all pretty much fall away. But in the middle of these events, Jesus entreats them to pray in order that they might not fall into temptation and fall away, but they fail to do that. Now, what that tells me, that if you want to avoid succumbing to temptation, then we are really called to be vigilant and to pray before the temptation appears. Pray as a way of warding off temptation, and I think really, in all honesty, that's the main application of the passage here. Certainly the middle of it anyway. They didn't pray when they should have, and subsequently we see them fall away. So instead of overcoming temptation, they were overcome by temptation. So I'd like to finish today's time together by just talking about this thing called temptation a bit. People fundamentally, I believe, are mainly overcome by temptation because of pride, just like Peter was here. Isn't that exactly what we've just seen happen? I won't do that, Lord, Peter said. All the rest might do it, but not me. And that was the short journey that Peter went from saying, I will never deny you, I'll die for you, to very soon he will say, I don't even know who he is. Within a few hours, in fact. Peter has not only an attitude of self-reliance, but arrogance as well. He overestimates his own spiritual strength in comparison to the others. He sets himself apart from the other disciples. He even says, they'll fall away, but I'll never do that. You see, pride likes to feed on our talents, our good points perhaps, but inflate them to the point where we feel they cover up our weak points. Beware of ever saying about anything, I would never do that, or I could never do that. By saying that you're never capable of doing what other people are doing, you're actually, by nature, saying you're better than other people. The other factor that is taught here about the way to overcome temptation, yes, avoid pride, but also we should focus on prayer. When the moment of testing came for Jesus, he prayed and he submitted to the will of God. Peter, on the other hand, he just slept through. What should have been his prayer time became just a time of sleep. So when he had to endure the test soon afterwards, of course he failed. Jesus here faces an emotional crisis and he prays, and having prayed, he found he was able to submit to the will of God. Peter didn't pray and he fell and then he fled. So when temptation comes, we are called to stand up to it, but we are called to stand up to it through prayer. I suspect every single one of us listening to this morning knows what our particular temptations are. Don't worry, we're not in a church environment. You're not going to raise your hand and you don't have to tell me. But do you know in your heart of heart what leads you and causes you to fall? Of course you do. And you know what? The Lord himself also knows what it is. So listen, friends, for I believe this is the take-home lesson of today's message. Start praying, and start praying today to overcome those things that tempt you to sin. Don't wait until you've done it. Don't wait until the consequences are staring you in the face. What I believe Jesus is teaching in this passage is very simple, that we're all to wake up, stay awake and pray. Wake up and pray. Wake up to the reality of our situation and pray before those situations take over us. By doing that, you will have a greater strength and you will be able to stand and not fall again. There was a 17th century Frenchman called Francis Fillon who wrote in one of his books a very helpful thing, and I'll quote it for you now. He said, tell God all that is on your heart and all that is pleasure and is pain. Tell him your troubles that he may comfort you. Tell him your joys that he may share them with you. Tell him your longings that he may purify them. Tell him your dislikes that he may help you conquer them. And tell him your temptations that he may shield you from them. That's 400-year-old advice from a Frenchman, but it still stands good today, I think. Tell him your temptations that he may protect you from them. That, I think, is the great lesson of this passage. It's to wake up and pray before temptation arises. Remember what we were told in the Lord's Prayer? Lead us not into temptation. He's telling us to pray before temptation strikes, before we fall and mess up. We spend too many times going to the Lord and praying about the things that have already happened. Don't wait until you're standing in the middle of the consequences of your wrong actions before you start to pray. Pray that you might not be led into temptation. There is the story of 3 ministers who were talking about the appropriate position one should take for prayer. As they were talking, a telephone repairman was working in the background repairing the church telephone system. One said, I hold my hands together and point them upward. The second said, no, real prayer should be conducted on your knees. The third said, no, they're both wrong. The only correct position for true prayer was flat on your face on the floor. By this time, the phone repairman, who was a believer, just couldn't keep quiet any longer, and he said this: I discovered that the most powerful prayer I ever made was the one I prayed whilst hanging upside down by my heels from a telephone pole 40 feet above the ground. Now I pray every day before I even go up the ladder. Hear me and hear me well. If you find yourself spiritually hanging upside down 40 feet above the ground, of course it's definitely time to pray, but in future, resolve to pray before you go up the ladder. Resolve to pray, lead me not into temptation. Okay, that's it for today, friends. Our lives in many ways are lived in gardens filled with both beauty and temptation. I hope that we can learn from the disciples' mistakes here, especially Peter's, and we too can resolve to be vigilant through prayer. Don't wait until you're in the middle of temptation's consequences to pray. Pray now. Seek God's strength to overcome the temptations in your life. I hope this episode has shed some light for you on the importance of prayer in its aspect of resisting temptation. And I do hope you'll join me again for our next instalment as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Mark, exploring its timeless wisdom and guidance for our lives today. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, prayer can really be your shield against temptation. If you're here for the first time, can I remind you that this podcast is hosted on the bibleproject.buzzsprout.com, but you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts from, whatever your favourite platform is. But it's at the Buzzsprout host website that you'll find all the links to all the ways to connect to this ministry, ways in which you can connect to it through social networks, and also on the podcast page itself you'll find episode notes and even a full transcript of everything I've said. All are freely available for you to use in whatever way is helpful. So with that all said, I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow. Join with me as we continue our amazing journey through the Gospel of Mark, through the entire Bible, in fact, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. So it's bye for now.